Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Per-Erik Milam about blameworthiness and forgiveness.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Per Milam, who's a researcher at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Per works on agency and moral responsibility and has published on a variety of topics, including several articles and book chapters on forgiveness in particular. And one of those publications is a chapter called Forgiveness in the Oxford Handbook of Moral Responsibility, which we're going to ask Per about in this interview today. So welcome to the show, Per. Can you start by telling us and our audience a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Taylor and Matt, for having me. It's really, really cool to be on this podcast. I've been listening to it a lot, and it's a fantastic show.
Nice, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I just got done actually with the last episode of last season, and I've got to say, as a person who in grad school started working on freedom and foreknowledge and fatalism and stuff like that, I wish so much I had had this resource. It would have made things just so much simpler. So anyway, everyone should go back and listen to that season.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun with that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but so how did I get interested in free will? So I think I almost feel like a little embarrassed because some of the people you've had on are like, oh, I was like 5 years old and I was really thinking about these difficult questions. This came up a lot in the last season, people especially who were theists or are theists are like, oh, I was grappling with these difficulties and things like that. And that just was not me at all, unfortunately. I don't think I was actually a very philosophically minded kid. So I encountered the free will problem in a philosophy course on free will and responsibility, or free will and determinism, more accurately. So it was my first philosophy course in undergrad at Pomona College. Baron Reed taught this course. And we read a lot of things, but the sort of main textbook for the course was Gary Watson's Anthology, but it was the 1982 first edition, not the 2002 second edition. So
Nice.
There wasn't Galen Strawson, there wasn't a lot of this stuff that sort of happened in the 90s.
Yeah.
But it was a great class. It was a really fun class. I loved it. And I think what really captivated me there was just the possibility of a challenge, which on the one hand, I didn't take very seriously, actually. I was like, no, threats to free will can't really be true. This really is a problem about understanding what it is that we have, because we have something. And so that was sort of my intro, and I didn't actually end up doing a lot more with it until grad school, though. So that was the first course I took in undergrad, and then it wasn't until grad school, 4 or 5 years later, that I took a couple courses with Dana Nelkin and with David Brink at UCSD, and there I was just struck by all these new threats to free will that had sort of become much more popular, had sort of gotten put in some really compelling formulations. So I'm thinking of stuff like, the manipulation arguments from Paraboom, luck arguments from a number of people. Situationism was really big at that time.
Yeah.
So I was just struck by that. And it was there that I really kind of started taking free will and responsibility seriously, and it just really was compelling to me. And I think part of that was just that my worldview had changed a little bit, sort of in the intervening 5 years, so in a way that sort of made me more open to the possibility that we didn't have free will, that this was genuinely a problem, as opposed to just a sort of who's right libertarians or compatibilists about the nature of our control and freedom. So I was just a lot more open to the possibility that we lack a really important kind of control over our beliefs and our attitudes and our actions. And I was also less willing to sort of take seriously as a basis for belief the feeling of free will, right? Which I think everyone really does have, or at least has a lot of the time. And I was just a little bit more willing to discount that as a kind of evidence. And so, because I took this possibility much more seriously, I just became really interested in the question that's sort of in the second half of Pereboom's first book, right, which is whether we could live in accordance with the belief that we don't have free will. And the more I thought about it, the more I came to believe that, yeah, we can live without free will or without the belief in free will. So I ended up writing a dissertation on the reactive attitudes, especially blaming attitudes, and how we might live without them, kind of essentially defending the Pereboom line from the second half of that book, Living Without Free Will. And that's kind of the story of how I encountered free will and sort of came to be working on it. There's a whole other story sort of about how that intersects with forgiveness. I can say a little bit about that if you want. But the short story there is just that I found myself thinking more and more about how we work through moral conflicts and how blame and forgiveness are part of that process or that practice. What they are, how they work, when and whether we ought to deploy them or use them. And I guess maybe another way to put that is just the more I thought about living without blame, the less interested I was in the details of sort of the free will question or the responsibility question, and the more interested I became in our responsibility practices, right? So blaming, apologizing, forgiving, and whether they have to be the way they are. And so, that's sort of the short part of the story about the link between responsibility and forgiveness for me.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, interesting. Well, as the name of the show implies, this is a podcast about free will. And although we've talked a lot about moral responsibility, blameworthiness, and related things, we've never talked about forgiveness. One might even think that giving an account of forgiveness is separate from theorizing about blameworthiness. Do you think that there's an important connection between blameworthiness and forgiveness?
Yeah, I do. I do think there's an important connection. I think, sort of in the most basic terms, I think that forgiving is overcoming blame, and blame is a response to perceived blameworthiness. And so that's a pretty tight connection. Maybe in more concrete terms, right? As we actually experience it, we forgive if we do forgive when we've been mistreated. When we've been attacked or humiliated or disrespected or just disregarded. However it is that we've been mistreated. So when I forgive you, right, I forgive you for something that you've done or that I think you've done, or said or thought or whatever. And something that I think is wrong for you to have done and that you culpably did wrong, right? So I think that, again, kind of emphasizes the connection. And maybe just one more way of thinking about it is this way, right? So if you think a person was entirely blameless for some bad behavior, right, it would be odd or even sort of confused to consider forgiving them for it. Right. And from the perspective of the blameless person that you're supposedly forgiving, right, it would be confusing or frustrating or even kind of objectionable, right, to receive your supposed forgiveness if, both of you are sort of upfront that you're viewing them as entirely blameless. And I think this kind of, again, emphasizes a tight connection or an important connection between blameworthiness and forgiveness. And I think all of this is sort of built into one of the most widely accepted distinctions in the literature about forgiving, the philosophical literature, and for that matter, the psychology literature, which is that forgiving is different from excusing, right? So bad behavior is excused when the person was not responsible for it, but we forgive behavior that we believe is unexcused.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that sort of captures most of the way in which I think this connection is pretty important.
Cool. Well, we want to ask you about different accounts of forgiveness, but before we do that, could you start by just kind of describing some standard cases of forgiveness?
Yeah, I think I can. So here's one thing that I'll do. I'll just give you a few cases from my paper that I think are helpful. But maybe one thing that I'll say before that is just there's a lot of standard kinds of cases that sort of pop up in the forgiveness literature. And I think part of that reflects the fact that we want our story about forgiveness, our account of forgiveness, to be one that covers, the real experiences that we all have, right? So they tend to be about things that are sort of in the moderate range of wrongdoing, right? So maybe infidelity or other kinds of betrayals, or sort of failing to be there for someone, or deceiving or mistreating them in some way. So the kinds of things that like we're all going to unfortunately do sometimes and have done to us sometimes, the kinds of moral conflicts we're actually going to experience. But I'll also say, right, that we want an account ultimately that's going to cover cases of pretty severe wrongdoing. So, assaults and murders and, even atrocities. So I'm going to give some cases that are sort of in that, moderate wrongdoing kind of realm. But if we want to talk about some of the more extreme cases and how they potentially complicate the issue, we can do that if we want. So here's sort of three cases that I like and I think sort of give us something to talk about. So one I call joke. I've used a version of this in a couple of my papers. Right. So one night at a party, Jesse overhears an acquaintance, Roy, tell what sounds like a racist joke about Latinos and is offended and angry with him. So Roy notices Jesse's reaction to his joke, and he recognizes that he's acted badly. He's ashamed. And later in the night, he finds Jesse and he apologizes to him for telling the hurtful joke. Jesse's relieved that Roy realized that this was inappropriate, and he's happy that he cared enough to talk to him about it. He forgives him, and despite some awkwardness, they continue to get along well in the future. Okay, so that's one kind of case. We can call that joke. I'll just give a sort of shorter version of a couple of others. Here's one where two people, Andrea and Kelly, they're taking grad school entrance exams, right? And during the test, Andrea notices that Kelly's cheating using a smartphone. And she's upset about this. And we can imagine a number of ways in which this might go, but there are various ways in which Kelly might do things, behave in certain ways, say certain things, either to Andrea or to her friends, that sort of give Andrea a reason to forgive in that kind of case. And then finally, we could imagine a sort of standard infidelity case, right, where David cheats on his partner, Donna. And maybe he thinks this isn't a big deal at first. Maybe he has some thoughts about why this is an okay thing to do, but then he decides that it's not, given their commitments to each other and so forth. And he's remorseful, and he tells Donna about it, and she forgives him, perhaps after some time or some reflection or some evidence that he's made amends or something along those lines. So those are kind of three, I think, everyday kinds of cases: infidelity, this kind of cheating on a test, getting an unfair advantage, and then sort of doing something offensive. These are, I think, experiences we can all kind of identify with to some degree or other. So yeah, I'll leave those on the table, and then we can talk about some views.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. In your chapter on forgiveness in the Oxford Handbook on Moral Responsibility, you discuss an account of forgiveness that you call the standard view, quote, end quote. Mm-hmm. What is the standard view, and what about the view do you think is compelling?
Yeah, so I think the standard view, the basic idea, right, is that the standard view says that to forgive is to overcome blame towards a person for a perceived culpable offense. And it has sort of three parts, I think. One is sort of what I call a change condition. This is a condition describing what changes when you forgive. I think that's really important to think about. This is sort of where I start theorizing about forgiveness is, what's changing when you forgive someone. And so for the standard view, the change condition says that in order to forgive, the offender must overcome her blame towards, the forgiver must overcome her blame towards the offender in response to the offender's subsequent attitudes and actions, right? What they do after they've sort of been confronted. So, the bumper sticker here, right, is you have to overcome blame.
Yeah.
There's also what I call a blameworthiness condition to the standard view. This says that in order to forgive, the victim must view the offender's behavior as blameworthy, or their character as blameworthy, depending on what the object is of their blame. And that's, I think, important sort of for the reasons I mentioned above, and we can get into that a little bit more if we want. And then finally, there's sort of a blame condition to the standard view. So the blame condition says that in order to forgive, a victim must first have blamed the offender for the offense, right? So just to sort of summarize that, you have to overcome blame, which of course means you have to have blamed, and you have to have viewed the offender's behavior as blameworthy. I think in addition, a lot of people who hold a version of the standard view also believe that the person needs to overcome blame for the right kinds of reasons. That's something we can talk about maybe more later, but the idea here is just that there's lots of ways in which you might overcome blame, but not all of them seem to be what's going on when we think of forgiving a person, right? So I have a case that I've used in a few papers to sort of make this point, which is that, at least according to some empirical research, which I've been part of, it is good for your cardiovascular health to forgive. Right, there are benefits to overcoming your blame, to thinking through why you might no longer blame a person. And yet, if I've done something wrong to you, right? Like I've humiliated you, Taylor, in some way, like been rude to you at a Q&A or something like that, right? If you're pissed off at me afterwards and sort of I pick up on that, if I come to you and say, Taylor, it'd be really good for your heart if you forgave me, if you stopped blaming me,
right.
you might agree. And if you have a heart condition, you might think this is a good reason to overcome blame. Yeah. But you wouldn't take me as having offered you a good reason to forgive me, right? You might think, look, I need to move on. I need to get past this. I need to let this go. Maybe I need to cut Per out of my professional life. But you're not going to think that I've given you a reason to forgive you. To forgive me. So yeah, this I think is sort of the crux of this idea that forgiving needs to be done for the right kinds of reasons. And so I think a lot of people who accept a version of the standard view accept a version of that condition as well, and I certainly do. So that is the standard view as I see it. And maybe one thing to sort of emphasize is that this is a family of views, and so different versions of it are going to be different, right? So I take myself to defend a version of this view, but I also take, for example, Lucy L.A., who I disagree with about a lot of things, to defend a version of this view. I think Geoffrey Murphy defends a sort of very famous version of this view. There's lots of versions. So that's the standard view. And why is it compelling? Well, I think it's compelling for a few reasons, but the main one is that I think it really captures clearly one of the really central experiences that we associate with forgiving, which is that we're angry, we're upset, we're holding the offense against the offender in a way, and then we're not doing that anymore. We change our attitude. We come to view the offender in a different way, again, for a variety of reasons, potentially. But it captures this sort of the moral psychology, I think, very well.
Yeah.
So that I think is sort of the main thing that makes this a compelling view. We can talk, I think, a little more later about other things that it gets right versus other views, but that I think is the main one.
Cool. Yeah, we do want to ask you to say more about another view that you discuss in that chapter that Matt just referenced, but maybe first we should ask, what are some objections to the standard view?
Yeah, good. So I guess in a way, like any philosophical view, you could probably object to any part. I think some objections are going to be more compelling than others, but right. So let's just talk about a few ways in which you might do that. So here's one: you might deny that forgiving requires a change of attitude at all, and this is, I think, going to be a characteristic of what I call norm changing views, which is sort of the other big category of view that I think is sort of out there in the landscape. So if to forgive is just to release a person from a reparative obligation, right? An obligation to apologize or make amends or something like that. If that's what forgiveness ultimately consists in, then this in principle doesn't require a change of attitude. I might still sort of be fuming about something, but nonetheless release you from any obligation to sort of make amends or start to repair the breach between us caused by your offense. So that's one way. I think that's one of the more compelling ways. One might try to deny the blame condition in various ways. I think this is a common response to versions of the standard view. So, right, you might think that you can forgive without ever having blamed, right? A sort of really common version of this objection might point out that, often we forgive immediately upon learning about the offense, right? We didn't know that we were mistreated, right? This is, I think the infidelity kinds of cases work well for this, right? So if David admits that he cheated on Donna and she forgives him then and there, well, that seems like it doesn't require blaming ahead of time. More controversially, you might think, if you think that you can sort of preemptively forgive someone, well, that's a way that you might forgive without blaming, right? I forgive you before you even do the bad thing. Another way to do this is to say, well, actually, you do need to overcome blame, but you don't need to entirely overcome it, right? You might think that blame needs to diminish, right? I need to not be as angry as I was, but I don't need to sort of not blame at all or not be at all disposed to blame. This is a view I think that has been attributed to Butler, Bishop Butler, one of the first sort of early modern philosophers to write about blame and forgiveness. And Ernesto Garcia has sort of pushed this as well. And then a final way to object, not a final way, but another sort of possible way you might object, there's never a final way.
That's right.
Is to just deny the right reasons requirement. This idea that you need to have the right kinds of reasons to forgive. You might say, no, a person could forgive for any reason or for no reason. So, right, again, if what forgiving ultimately amounts to is something like releasing someone from an obligation of repair, then if that can be done sort of at will and by fiat, then arguably it doesn't require any sort of special reasons. In the same way that, I don't need special reasons to make a promise to Matt or to release Matt from a promise. So that's another way.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk more about the norm-changing view. Can you describe it in a little bit more detail and maybe explain some of the ways that it fares better than the standard view?
Yeah. So again, this is a family of views. I call them the norm-changing views. This is sort of the label that I decided to use for this chapter in the Oxford Handbook. And I take this class of views to sort of be the main competitor to the class of standard views. And I associate it primarily with Daniel Nelkin, Brandon Warmke, and Christopher Bennett. They all have versions of this view. And I take the core of this view to be the claim that forgiving is primarily or entirely a matter of changing the normative significance of an offense for the people involved, right? For the offender and the victim. So one might say that to forgive is to release an offender from a reparative obligation. This is a kind of how I just described it a few minutes ago, right? You acquire a reparative obligation when you offend, right? So when David cheats on Donna, or when Kelly cheats on the exam that her and Andrea are both being assessed on. The offender in those cases acquires an obligation to repair. That might be different in different circumstances. It might be an obligation to confess and apologize and show your trustworthiness. It might be a requirement to sort of set right whatever unfair advantage you got, right, by cheating on the test, for example. If it's a grad school entrance exam, maybe you sort of agree not to apply to graduate schools, right? So that you don't have that unfair advantage you got from cheating. Whatever. Yeah. So the idea here is that to forgive is to release an offender from that kind of obligation. And again, we can think about that in terms of our earlier cases. Whereas the standard view says that what's going on when Andrea forgives Kelly for cheating is that Andrea feels a different way. She views Kelly in a different way. She has a different attitude towards Kelly. She no longer blames her. Rather, she has this other non-blaming attitude. What the norm-changing view is going to say is no. What it is for Kelly to no longer expect. For Andrea to no longer expect Kelly to do these reparative acts, apologize, make amends, etc. So how might this kind of view fare better than the standard view? Well, I think that people like Brandon Warmke are right to sort of ask and emphasize why we care about forgiveness, why it matters to us. And I think what they want to claim, what people like Brandon want to claim, is that its significance rests on normative changes that it brings about for the offender, rather than emotional changes that are undergone by the forgiver, right? So on these kinds of accounts, forgiveness matters because it releases me, the offender, from a debt or an obligation, or it raises me up from a lowered position. And it's not because you, the forgiver, feel differently about me. And I think one way to put this is to say that, attitude change accounts, like the standard view, accounts that say what it means to forgive is to have this change of attitude, this overcoming of blame, they can't explain why forgiving alters the norms between the offender and the victim, why it's going to be wrong, for example, for the victim to continue being upset or to continue holding the offense against the person after they've forgiven. Because if forgiving is just a matter of having a change of attitude, well, I can change my attitude and change back whenever I want. But if what I've done is sort of altered the normative situation between us, released you from an obligation, then that's a sort of change that I just can't reverse at will. And this seems to be something that is a feature of forgiveness for many people. Right. Or so the norm changing view might claim.
Yeah. That's cool. That's a really helpful way of thinking about sorting different kind of types of views. I'm curious, and I think you say something about this in the chapter in the Oxford Handbook, but do you see these categories of views as sort of incompatible with each other, or do you think you could have a view that kind of incorporates elements from both? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think some versions, again, because these are classes of views, I think some versions of each view are going to be incompatible with each other, right? Mm-hmm. So a version of the standard view might deny that necessarily that forgiving necessarily changes the offender's obligation, right, to apologize, right? A version of the standard view might say, no, you might still have an obligation to apologize even after someone's forgiven you. Mm-hmm. And a version of the norm-changing view might claim that forgiving does do this, right? That expecting an apology after having forgiven is inappropriate. Mm-hmm. So those two versions are incompatible with each other. But I do think that there are types or versions of these two views that are potentially complementary, right? So here's just one way we might see them as complementary. One might argue that forgiveness is fundamentally both an emotional change and a normative change, and that those are sort of tied together in an important way, right?
Yeah.
So according to such a view, forgiving might require both overcoming blame and releasing the offender from the reparative obligation, perhaps because one no longer blames, right? And one no longer blames for the reasons that one should release from the obligation, right? So perhaps the reason that I no longer blame blame Taylor, right, is the reason I should also release him from his obligation to apologize or to continue sort of doing penance to restore the relationship.
Yeah.
And that I think makes a lot of sense. So that's I think a way in which these two views might be seen as complementary. I also think, though, that in addition to asking sort of whether the two kinds of views are complementary, sort of two parts of the whole story of forgiveness, we might also ask if they're separate or separable, right? We might ask if these are just two different phenomena that happen to go by the same name. And I think some have suggested something along these lines. Marilyn McCord Adams has a view kind of like this from 1991. Christopher Bennett has a view kind of like this in his 2003 paper. And I think there's something to that idea as well, right? Which is just actually these are really different phenomena, right? The phenomenon of overcoming your blame, no longer holding someone's behavior against them, viewing them in a new or in a different way, in a way that allows you to carry on, whatever pre-existing relationship you had. That's one thing. That's definitely something that's part of our lives that we all recognize. But then there's this other thing as well, which is where I say to you, I forgive you, where I sort of, in some performative manner, release you from an obligation or sort of announce that your status is different than it was when I was blaming you. And that just seems like a different type of thing. First of all, it's a different category of event, right?
Yeah.
One is an internal change in me, and the other is a sort of normative or ethical change in kind of the normative landscape. And so that's a reason to think maybe not only are they sort of complementary pieces of a story, but actually just different phenomena entirely that happen to go under the same name, and both of which are really important.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. What are some other implications of these accounts of forgiveness?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of potential implications. I think one of the things that we do to sort of one of the ways we kind of identify desiderata for what constitutes a good or an adequate account of forgiveness is to sort of consider what the implications are for various features that we recognize in our own experience of forgiving. So I think there's a few. I'll mention sort of three in particular, but we can talk about others as well. So there are implications of these views for what we might think of as the difficulty of forgiving, the possibility of reversing forgiving, or what Monique Wonderly calls unforgiving, where that's un-forgiving as opposed to being unforgiving. And then the third one is sort of mistakes about having forgiven, like whether a person can be mistaken. So just to start with the issue of difficulty, it seems like forgiving is something that can be difficult, right? Indeed, I think people often try to forgive and take themselves to have failed, right? And we can probably say this of others as well, right? We can say, this person really wants to forgive, her partner or her friend or her parent or whomever, and she can't do it.
Yeah.
This is, I think, a really important part of people's lives. And to me, this suggests that forgiving can't just be a decision. It can't be something that's completely voluntary. And this is something that's been emphasized by various people over the years. Herbert Morris, I think, does maybe the best job of it in a response to Geoffrey Murphy's paper. But if one could forgive at will simply by deciding, then we'd have to explain the apparent difficulty of forgiving in some other way, right?
Yeah.
Maybe we'd want to say that what's difficult is getting oneself to a place where one can decide to forgive, but that the actual forgiving is just something that anyone can do at any time. Or perhaps the difficulty of forgiving is actually just the difficulty involved in a hard choice, like the decision about whether to have children or whether to move for a new job or something like that. The decision itself is hard to make, even though the act of deciding is always sort of, in some sense, something you can just do.
Right.
So this is, I think, one area where the different views are going to have to say different things to account for difficulty. And maybe, I think, in this case, I think the standard view has sort of the easier, more intuitive response, which is just, yeah, it's hard because an emotional change is hard to accomplish, especially when there are strong reasons and strong motivations in the other direction. So that's difficulty. That's one thing. I think another area where sort of we can look at the implications of these two families of views to sort of assess their plausibility is the idea of reversing or withdrawing forgiveness, or again, of unforgiving someone. And so, like I said, Monique Wonderly's recently written a couple of papers about this that are really good. And the idea here is something like this, right? It seems very natural and plausible to say that, right, Donna might forgive David because he seems genuinely remorseful in light of his mistreatment of her. But if she learns that he was deceiving her and is actually completely unapologetic, that he was manipulating her or something like that, then she might unforgive, right? She might take it back. And again, the standard view sort of has no problem with this phenomenon. Not only does it seem fairly common to be upset, to come to blame again when you learn that someone has sort of tried to pull the wool over your eyes, but it also seems to make sense normatively, right? That your reasons for blaming are still there and always have been there. And so to return to that state of blaming the person just makes complete sense. Norm-changing views, I think, have a little bit of a harder time with this kind of idea. And this is because the power that one exercises in forgiving, according to those kinds of views, is not obviously reversible. And again, this is a family of views, so some versions might have a better time than others. But I think in many cases, sort of the reversibility of the normative change is hard to spell out, hard to sort of make plausible. So compare with promising, for example, right? If you've promised to pay me back and I've waived that obligation, right? It seems not only wrong, but kind of mistaken to then come back to you and demand the money that you originally promised me.
Yeah.
It's not like I couldn't do it, but it seems like it's not within my power to sort of reverse the decision and make you once again obligated to me. In the forgiveness case, right, suppose that you humiliate me and I blame you. If I forgive and release you from the obligation to sort of make amends, apologize, what have you, then it seems objectionable to later begin blaming you again and sort of demanding that you atone further or what have you. So Brandon Warmke again sort of makes this point, and that seems right to me. But this insight, I think, is an obstacle to an account of withdrawing forgiveness or unforgiving. Maybe there's an account that could be given, but this, I think, is another place where the standard view sort of gets the implications more right.
Yeah.
So let's see. That's difficulty, that's reversal, and then a last thing we might talk about is being mistaken about having forgiven, right? So it seems like people can be mistaken about whether they have in fact forgiven. This is something I think maybe less common than the other two phenomena, but it's certainly something that I think is both not just plausible but actual, right? And in really serious cases, you can hear people make exactly this claim, right? So
Yeah.
there's a really famous case from the early 2000s of a man who murdered a number of school children in an Amish community. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the sort of just incredible features of that story is that the very same day, many of the parents and family members of these children who were killed forgave the murderer who himself had been killed, um, and it's it's baffling, I think, to many of us how someone could do that.
Yeah.
But when you read sort of the accounts that followed up with these Amish parents and family members after the fact, one thing you hear some of them say is, I forgave in some sense, or I tried to forgive, but one of the things I realized over the subsequent years as I really worked through this experience was that I didn't do it on that day.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have done it now, one of them said, but I didn't do it on that day, like I said that I did. Not in the sense that they were deceiving themselves or others, but in the sense that they realized that it's a process that takes time. That it really
Right.
took sort of effort to do what they wanted to do. And I think
Mhm.
this just seems absolutely right to me. This seems like
Mhm.
the right description. It is their own description in this particular case, which I think is
Right.
a good point in favor of the view. And again, this is another place where I think the standard view has kind of an easy account to give, right? Forgiving is an internal change. We don't have perfect access to or knowledge of our own internal states, so we can't be certain of what we've done. And we can realize, because it's difficult, because we realize its difficulty, that we haven't accomplished the task yet, and that we're mistaken, have been mistaken in thinking that we had. Um, so again, standard view, I think, can sort of say that fairly straightforward thing, and norm changing views, I think, again, have a harder time with this kind of claim, at least on the face of it. It's hard to say that one can be mistaken about whether one released another from an obligation.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
One can imagine being tricked into forgiving and being mistaken for that reason, but that's just not what's happening in most of the cases we might think of as sort of common cases of being mistaken. That's certainly a thing that could happen, sure, but
Yeah.
that's certainly not what we're seeing in the Amish case or in other cases we might imagine. So I think overall it's harder for the norm changing views to capture this idea of thinking that you've succeeded when you actually haven't. Yeah, so those are sort of three areas where we might sort of test uh, standard views and norm changing views against some potential implications. There's lots more I think we could talk about, right? We could talk about, do the different views make sense of phenomena like self forgiveness? Do they have implications for standing to forgive and things like that? I'm happy to talk about any of that more if we want, but I think I think these sort of three features, difficulty, reversal, and being mistaken, really capture, I think, a lot of what's real and uh, part of our sort of actual experience of forgiving that we want to capture in a philosophical theory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much, Per, for exploring
sure.
those views with us and talking through implications. If people who are listening want to read some of your papers, follow your work, where can they go to find you online?
Yeah, I think the best place is probably just my personal website. So it's per-erikmilam.com. And if you don't find what you want there, you probably won't find it anywhere. But there are other places to look. So I have a Fill People page.
Yeah. Good.
And if you want to find out information about sort of what I'm working on now, I have a grant that I just finished a project for, and I have a new grant-funded project that's about to start. You can find information about that on my department website at Gothenburg University.
Very cool. Thanks again, Per.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's a pleasure chatting with y'all.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. In our next episode, our guest will be Justin Coet, assistant professor at Bridgewater State University.